Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The Forgotten Elizabeth of York. One of the most significant figures that helped to bring the Wars of the Roses to an end was Elizabeth of York. She had agreed to marry Henry Tudor, and following his victory over Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, the couple married and Henry VII was declared King of England, and Elizabeth became the Queen Consort of England. Together the pair would be the father and mother of the Tudor dynasty, with kings and queens such as Henry VIII and Bloody Mary I being part of the ruling royal family. But in the medieval royal courts there was another Elizabeth of York who lived at the same time, and she was also the Duchess of Suffolk. But today this Elizabeth has been lost to time in favour of her namesake, but she was related to the kings of the Yorkist dynasty, Edward IV and Richard III, being their sister. But what is the story of the forgotten Elizabeth of York? Born on the 22nd of April 1444 in Rouen in Normandy, Elizabeth of York, also known as Elizabeth Plantagenet, was born into an incredibly important family. Her father was Richard Plantagenet, the third Duke of York, who was the one who championed the House of York's claims to the English throne over the House of Lancaster. Elizabeth's father would be the key figure in a political upheaval of the 15th century, and for him it was important that his children married well, to ensure that the Yorkist dynasty was strong in the face of the Wars of the Roses. Her mother was Cecily Neville, who was the Duchess of York, and she would later become the mother of the two kings and the grandmother of a queen. So Elizabeth had the best upbringing in England at the time, and it would have been expected that she would marry an important noble across England. But before February of 1458, she was married to John de la Pole. He was just 2 years older than her, but this means that Elizabeth was married at the age of 14, before her 15th birthday. Her husband was a powerful man, and he was the eldest son and the heir of William de la Pole, the first Duke of Suffolk. Her father-in-law was a man, though, who could have been interpreted as an enemy of the Yorkist dynasty. He was a man who had been considered the power behind the throne of Henry VI from 1447 to 1450, and he certainly would have helped Henry rule. Henry himself wasn't the strongest and most valiant king, and the first Duke of Suffolk in his 3 years aiding the king would be a disaster. He oversaw the almost complete loss of English territory in France, much which had been gained by Henry's father, and also he saw the losses that the English were having in France at the time. Suffolk was blamed for the failings, and he was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and had been attainted, and it was likely that he would have been executed. But this eventually did come, as he was subjected to a mock trial, and was then beheaded. But Elizabeth's husband then became the second Duke of Suffolk, and with this Elizabeth became the Duchess of Suffolk. She received this after her older brother, Edward IV, ousted Henry VI from the throne and seized the crown. He reinstated his brother-in-law and Elizabeth's husband, and Elizabeth remained the Duchess of Suffolk until his death around 1491. But the couple then lived in Wingfield in Suffolk. Elizabeth, however, had many children with her husband. Her first was named John, who was the first Earl of Lincoln, and he eventually became the designated heir to his uncle Richard III, who took the throne in 1483. He would later rebel against Henry VII and was killed at the Battle of Stoke Field. Her second and third sons were Geoffrey and Edward de la Pole, but then she had a daughter named Elizabeth after her. Another son was born in 1471, and he became later the third Duke of Suffolk, and he was a Yorkist pretender who would later be beheaded during the reign of Henry VIII as he rose up. Further children were had, with a daughter named Dorothy being born in 1472. However, she died young. Humphrey was the next child, and then another 2 daughters followed, named Anne, who became the 7th Prioress of Sion Abbey, and Catherine, who was born in 1477. Her penultimate child was Sir William de la Pole, who was a knight of the Wingfield Castle, but he was kept inside the Tower of London, and it's believed that he was held there for an incredible 37 years until he died. Longer than another prisoner in the Tower's history. Her final son was Richard de la Pole, who was also a Yorkist pretender, but with this it meant that Elizabeth of York and her husband, the Duke of Suffolk, had 11 children, and it's clear that they were focused on building a powerful duopoly, Yorkist dynasty, for themselves. But during her reign, one of her biggest links to the throne of England was that two of her brothers would become kings of England. Edward IV became the real victor of the Wars of the Roses, as he managed to force Henry VI off the throne, defeating him in the battle. With this, Edward IV then aimed to deal with the Lancastrians once and for all, and despite being deposed by Henry and the Earl of Warwick, he regained the crown. By being the sister of a powerful king, it meant that Elizabeth of York had a powerful place at court, and that she would also have had probably a royal household. Following the death of Edward IV, also, she would be an aunt to the princes in a tower, who shockingly disappeared inside the Tower of London, and it's believed that Elizabeth's brother, Richard, had them killed. But he would too take the throne, meaning that another brother of Elizabeth then became King of England. But Richard's reign was short and lasted 2 years before he was then defeated at the Battle of Bosworth Field by Henry Tudor. It's not known how Elizabeth was viewed in the eyes of the Tudors, but what her children could be considered would have been a threat to the Tudors' legitimacy and rights to the crown. Henry VII, for example, as well as his father, would imprison many of the duopoles as they were concerned that they belonged to the House of York, and they were a threat to the Tudor dynasty. Henry VIII, for example, would later wield the axe to all of the Yorkist threats to his throne. But despite surviving her husband by almost a decade, the last mention of Elizabeth of York was in 1503, and at this time she was a woman of around 58, which was considered elderly by the early 16th century standards. She died before May of 1504 and was then buried in the church in Wingfield in Suffolk, a place which was important to her and her husband. But today she is often overshadowed by Elizabeth of York, the one that married Henry VII and united the House of York and the House of Lancaster. She would be her niece, and Edward IV may have named her after his sister. But Elizabeth, the Duchess of Suffolk, was an important medieval lady who had many children, and was the sister of 2 of England's kings. She would have had an important role in England's politics during the Wars of the Roses, and would have been a prominent part of court life. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.